All right, so if you came for an exciting, engaging lecture, you got ripped off. It's going to be super dry, super philosophical, but I'll try to make it as interesting and engaging as I can. So we've heard a lot about simplicity. We've heard a lot about Neoplatonism. We've heard about merging with the one, emanations, immanentism. So let's talk about why this matters. Why do the church fathers get into this? And basically what I'm going to do is go through a long talk about philosophy gibberish to show the inadequacy and stupidity of philosophy. So you're going to see in 1.5 hours, hopefully, the stupidity of this system. And we're going to link it to not just Aristotle, not just the important positions that we see in the figure of Eunomius, one of the key early church heretics who was a kind of radical Arian. We're also going to see it in the Greeks, the Hellenic dialectics that we're going to look at. We're going to notice it in Allah in terms of the classical Sunni tradition, which is what we've been interacting with. So unfortunately, Islam is kind of like Protestantism, where you have a whole bunch of schools and sects, but you can kind of get sort of general ideas. So we're going to take kind of the position that we had with Sheikh Azhar Rashid as the exemplary. Then we're going to look at the Roman Catholic system. I'll make a few comments if I can about Protestantism as well to tie it all in. So Aristotle and other philosophers give us this idea of potency and act. I'll try to define these as best I can for those who are not sort of into philosophy. I'm not an Aristotle scholar. Father Deacon is.
Hi guys, I'm an Aristotle scholar.
There's Aristotle. So not everything necessarily that I say about Aristotle will be perfect, but we're going to try to capture this as best we can. So, so basically what Aristotle wants to do is give us a philosophical description of metaphysics that's coherent, that explains actual substances and things in the world, external reality, etc. He has the conception of God that he will call the first actualizer, the first mover, the perpetual actualizer, the eternal actualizer. And what he actualizes is something other than himself at all times. One of the key things that he does give us that's useful for theology, though, is the distinction between essence and energy. So that's actually an Aristotelian distinction. And yes, the Neoplatonic influence on the church fathers is at times even countered by Aristotle. Excuse me. The Neoplatonic doctrines are countered by the church fathers, and they use sometimes Aristotelian distinction. So we're going to see St. Basil actually uses some of these ideas to rebut the Neoplatonic assumptions of Eunomius, who's going to be our key kind of model heretic that will be present in all these guys, right? So even though this is going to be kind of the Greek assumption, this is going to be kind of the Islamic and Catholic, you're going to notice the pattern of Eunomius in each of these, and you're going to see the distinction between those and our system, particularly in the Cappadocians, particularly in the letters of St. Basil and the key distinctions that St. Basil makes. So one of the distinctions that we want to talk about is not just potency and act, which is the movement from a state of potentia, right? It's what something could be, to what it is or is actualized as, right? So for example, in this analogy, I might have the skill to beatbox, but I don't. If I don't actually beatbox, I haven't actualized beatboxing. But I possess, right, this potentia, this power. And so Basil's going to make key use of this notion of the distinction between dunamis, right, or the potential, or the ability to do something, as opposed to actually doing it. And so God can possess both of those things. He can possess the dunamis power, and in fact, many powers that he does not necessarily have to actualize. Now, why is that a problem for these systems? Because if that's the case, this is not the case, and this is going to be definitive for all of these positions. Even though this doesn't necessarily use the phrase pure act, which I'll get to in a minute, Actus Purus, this system still borrows heavily from that, especially in the Middle Ages when Islam comes into popularity into its. It has an early stage, I should mention, which is very simplistic. And it's very anti-philosophical. Then they move into the Kalam stage where they do reasoning philosophy. And when they move into that stage, the ironic thing is that they're going to borrow directly from all of this, but they're going to say, Oh, we got that from Allah, by the way, right? So they didn't get it from the Greeks who had it before them. They got it from Allah, yeah, sure. Right, just like the biblical text come before them and contradict their text, but it comes perfectly from Allah. So when Basil talks about the distinction between these things, between energy, or which we're saying is the same thing basically here as activity in our theology. When he talks about the distinction between something being in potentia or to have a power that you don't necessarily actualize, this comes into focus with the doctrine of creation. Because what you're going to notice is that these systems are not going to be able to give an account for our unique doctrine of creation ex nihilo. In fact, pure act will make that impossible. I'm sure people have heard us talking about this, but we're going to get into how that is the case. So in terms of expressing a capacity, right? Energeia is the expression of the capacity or this dunamis, this faculty or this potentia that one possesses, that the agent possesses. And so by doing this action, we move from a state of potency to act. Now, for Aristotle, the first mover, the unactualized actualizer, cannot have this kind of stuff going on. And there's reasons for that. And the reason primarily is that he has presuppositions. You may have heard this word, presupposition. We're going to critique these presuppositions. And this comes from what's called the perfections, or excuse me, the table of opposites from Pythagoras. So Aristotle borrows this table of opposites. And you'll notice that he's got this assumption that the good corresponds to number one, being. So he means the highest, supreme, ultimate being in his mind, and unmoved mover, which is self-referencing thought thinking itself in a kind of never-ending circle. Unity is better or perfect or more perfect, right, than multiplicity, being over non-being. Rest. This is key because rest, immobility, stasis is going to be fundamental to origin. It's going to be fundamental to the Neoplatonic idea. And a lot of these Hellenic dialectics are going to underlie these systems as well. So remember, these are in not just distinction to these are in opposition. They're opposites, okay? Being in this system is opposite non-being. Unity in this system is opposite multiplicity. Rest in this system is opposite motion. And so for this means that God must possess, the first cause must essentially be these things in contrast, in distinction, in dialectical contrast with these things. These things are a diminished ontological status. They do not possess the highest degree of ontology, perfection, unity, simplicity that these things possess. This is fundamental to not just Aristotle, but you're going to notice that through most of the Hellenic mindset, you could say, generally speaking, the philosophers I'm speaking of here. And you're going to notice so many heretics have the same problem. This dialectical opposition is going to be running through all of these heretics. And it's not just these things, they'll have dialectical opposition between this. Because this, in a sense, can be said to be opposite of that, right? So in a lot of these systems, this distinction entails opposition, opposites, dialectics. So dialectics, right, refers to opposition between two things. We don't do that. Why do we not do that? Well, because our God is not, in a definitional sense, pure act. Yes, some church fathers will say we can speak of God in a manner of speaking as pure act. Maximus at the beginning of the 200 chapter says in the first 5 pages, we can speak of God as pure act only in contrast to creatures, only in contrast to things that come to be in time. Why is that? Because the things that come to be in time are acted upon. God acts upon the things in time. And the things in time, yes, they do possess the feature of potency to act. They do possess change. They do possess these, they're not purely in stasis, right? And again, this mindset, remember, it believes that things that are in stasis are better. Now, the amazing thing about this is that we know that the Greeks are smart people. We know that they have amazing, tremendous insights, right? Even the Neoplatonists, even crazy guys like Stoics, like they have insights that the church fathers use. But one thing that they don't do is question certain presuppositions, like, why is this perfect? Why is that more perfect than that thing? It's just sort of assumed. There's not any a priori thing that we look at the world and we just know, oh, okay, well, we know that unity is better than multiplicity. I mean, many philosophers would come along and say, no, actually multiplicity is better. In fact, maybe we should all just be anarchists. Maybe we should wreck this whole system and destroy any notion of unity. Maybe motion is better than rest or stasis. There's no a priori reason to know or assume or think that one is automatically ontologically superior, higher, better, right? And you can begin to see that since these things characterize the created world, creation begins to be negated. Creation is seen in an increasingly negative attitude, diminished attitude. Creation is something that we need to escape from, especially in Platonism. I'm speaking of Plato, particularly Plato. Now, Aristotle is a little better in that he does have a pretty positive view of this world, of the polis of life, virtues, etc., what we need to do in this life, the body, right? He's not as negative as what we see in people like Plato. But what we're going to notice is that this, for Basil and for the Cappadocians, this is fundamental to the Trinity. And it's fundamental not because of some philosophical reasoning. It is philosophical, but it's philosophical reasoning that's fundamental to the Trinity because Revelation contains these ideas. In other words, we know that God could have created a bunch of different worlds. He could have created any logically possible world. We don't believe he created every logically possible world, right? And so there is, in some sense, a kind of potentia that God has because he possesses free will. And if he possesses free will and he has that potentia, if he did not actualize every possible world, then he's not pure act, because this means there's no unrealized potentia in God. So you cannot have this as a definitional sense of who God is in his inner being. That's precisely what happens kind of here, and then definitely here. We'll see that in a minute. So pure act is fine in St. John Damascus and in St. Maximus as a way to describe God only in relation to creation. When we get to the inner life of God, theology proper, God ad intra, Maximus says, this is dumb. Dumb. You can't say this about God in his inner life because it becomes a reductionist move. And that reductionist move is what we're going to look at now. And this is from Eunomius, an important thing called identity thesis. An identity thesis is basically the idea that when we name God, when we speak about what these names mean, what they signify, what are they picking out, what are they predicating, what are they referring to, in God, it's all identical. Okay? So we know that Eunomius has this position. Read your Roman Catholic definition for an example. Ludwig Ott says in his Fundamentals of Catholic Dogma, it's a classic, right? This is section 3, the difference between the attributes and essence of God. The divine attributes are both identical with the divine essence, as well as amongst themselves, and that is de fide. Okay? So that in Roman Catholic theology, de fide means dogma. Can't question that. It's not up for dispute. It's dogmatic. The reason for this, Ott says, lies in the simplicity of God. The acceptance of any real distinctions would lead to an acceptance of composition in God. So the assumption of identity thesis here, promoted by them dogmatically. By the way, it's also in the Fourth Lateran Council. It's Peter Lombard's teaching, which the Fourth Lateran Council accepts, which reduces person to nature. So for Lombard, he is what he is in his essence. And that is identical to the phrase that Eunomius uses. Eunomius says the exact same thing that Peter Lombard says, ironically. So that's the Roman Catholic doctrine. And we see that God has to be this. Why? Because anything that is potency to act, according to this system, this corresponds to matter to form. Okay. So potency is to act as matter is to form, right? So when matter is informed, it has form. And that's like the move or similar to the move of potentia to actuality. This cannot be in God, as you see, right? Why is that? Well, let's listen to what the dumb ox says. So in question 1, That's Aquinas for those who don't know. Summa, volume 1, section question 3. Is God composed? I absolutely answer. It is absolutely true that God is not a body, and this can be shown in several ways. First, because no body is in motion unless it's put in motion. Secondly, I'm going to move down. Well, he says because the unmoved mover has not moved. Secondly, because the first being must of necessity be in act. Okay? And in no way in any potentia. Okay, this is from the same. For although any single thing that passes from potentia to actuality, the potentiality is prior in time to the actuality. Nevertheless, absolutely speaking, actuality is prior to potentiality, because God is the first pure act, which provides the composite reality that's the created world of matter and form, potency and act. So it's just obvious, dude, right? God has to be this because this is better than that. Now, one thing that's great about, I'll just say briefly about non-being, that Father St. Eloy talks about quite a bit of this the first volume of Orthodox dogmatics, is that you might be surprised, this is not the opposite for us. God has no opposite. God is not in any dialectical opposition to anything, to any metaphysical principle, idea, whatever. This is not inherently bad, it's not inherently evil, and it's not in opposition to being. Because if we thought that, right, then we're back in this dialectical thinking that God has to have the opposite of himself in order to be who he is. Why is that a problem? Well, for Aristotle consistently took this doctrine and applied it the way it's supposed to be understood. He's actually more consistent than these people or these people. Because this doctrine means that if there's no potentia in God, there's no possibility that God could have done one thing over another thing. In other words, freely to create or not to create, or to create this world or other worlds, or multiple logically possible worlds. By the way, I'm sure you've all heard my joke about how can we easily disprove Roman Catholicism. Is it logically possible that God could create a world without the Pope and Aquinas? Yes. Then we don't need the Pope and Aquinas. There's no logical necessity to do that. So, in terms of the created order, this leads to a necessary eternal creation. Why? Because you need the idea of potentia, you need the ability for God to do or will different things, so that he's not constrained to always be an eternal act, right? Now, when we get over here, we'll notice that there's going to be the problematic doctrine of the divine ideas for this system, which our system actually makes sense of because we talk about the logi. The logi are not in the divine essence. But for this to be the case, for God to be self-referencing, perpetual circular thought thinking itself, notice that this is an idealized, almost an image of the Greek mind, right? It's like God is essentially what every Greek philosopher thought himself to be, right? Like, I'm the most intellectual guy. Reasoning is clearly a higher faculty than the body. So God must be like just reasoning. And what does God think about? So, he's like so narcissistic. But no, seriously, the Aristotelian God is a total self-referencing narcissist. He literally talks about it being self-referencing. Now, what about this self-referencing is particularly useful for us here is that this Unitarian conception of God is very similar to the Eunomian doctrine, where Eunomius, the early church heretic, who took his divine simplicity very seriously, such that he believed that the doctrine of ingeneracy, or God being ungenerate, not generated, was literally who God is in his essence, and literally who the Father is. The Father is ingenerate and is the divine essence. This is strict identity thesis, right? So just step back for a moment and think about the Roman Catholic apologetic, how confused and how like all over the place they are when they counter us on this point. That they have missed the fundamental argument of the Cappadocians, Basil especially, Basil's whole point is to utilize Eunomius, Potentia, right? It's referenced in Bradshaw's paper at the end, concept of divine energy at the very end, to refute identity thesis. So if Basil is not teaching us the synergy distinction, then he's not refuting Eunomianism. I mean, this is so obvious, right? And one thing that I'm going to get to at the end, which you're going to be probably surprised. Guess what? All of this gibberish is based on human autonomous reasoning, natural theology. It does not require any repentance, any purification of the notions of these concepts through asceticism, through divine revelation. But guess what Basil says? Basil says, no, none of this is going to work. The words aren't going to work. The divine names aren't going to work. We can't divinely name God unless we've undergone repentance, unless we've purified a lot of these words and the predicates that we're using here, the names of earthly conceptions. And by that, he doesn't mean they turn into the opposite of themselves. He just simply means they become the correct doctrine of analogia, which is going to be not analogia entis, but analogia energeia for us, basically. Okay. That's going to be very different from the Thomistic system. So, one funny point that I noticed reflecting on these things was, so when we think about this and this, right? God possesses no form. God possesses no form because form applies to matter and form, that which is changeable, that which is in the created order. How is God the storehouse of the forms? But he possesses no form. But he's the storehouse of all the forms. But he's absolutely simple. And everything that we say about him, his identity thesis. Do you see what I'm saying? I mean, is this obvious yet? Right? So here's the Thomistic conception, the Aristotelian conception. This is in Aristotle too, by the way, right? What do we mean by this? We heard the divine mind mentioned, okay? What does Aquinas say about the divine mind and the divine knowledge? So this is God. The divine mind, the divine knowledge, right? These are just different ways of describing that thing right there. Okay? They're just words that do have a kind of descriptive, like virtual distinction. But they're just ways to describe supposedly this thing. But this thing is not in space and time. It's outside of space and time. So how do we know these words match up to this? Oh, well, you see, there's this created wall here. There's this wall of time and space. And this thing has all these different causal things that it does, supposedly, which actually, if that's the case, this doesn't have different cause, right? It doesn't cause different, it doesn't do different things if that's the case, okay? So this divine mind, this absolutely simple identity thesis thing here, generic theism from natural theology. The way we know this thing is that it does these different things to the created world. And the created world, and here we are, right? We're perceiving these created effects. These created effects come into our mind, and then our mind has different notions. Our minds are chocolate chip cookies. Our minds have different notions of what that is based on these different created effects. But guess what? This is going to be a problem. Because these created effects and the created objects of the sensible world, this world, these are based on forms, the divine ideas. Guess where the divine ideas are? Okay, those are different things. We said this. So we don't actually know that there's different things in the divine essence. It also doesn't make any sense to say that there's different things in the divine essence. And the Roman Catholic, the Thomistic response to this is to say, well, yeah, but like all of these different things are kind of arranged in a hierarchy. And so they're like supremely simple up at the top. And then they kind of like filter down in like into multiplicity, right? In a kind of Neoplatonic thing, right? But again, that's begging the question, because you told me that all I know about this thing is the created effects on this side of this wall here between God and creatures. And let's notice something about this. If these things are opposites, being is opposite not being, unity is opposite multiplicity, rest is opposite motion. Is that similar to that at all? No, it's not. And I'm going to go back to the line here in a second, but while we're on the Roman Catholic Thomistic system, wait a minute. So Thomas wants us to have the idea of a perfectly simple essence or substance that's equivalent to pure act. It's equivalent to Aristotle's unmoved mover, first actualizer. So he's one. He's timeless, he's unmoved, he's unchanging, he's simple. Those things are opposite these things. One is opposite many, time is opposite eternity, moved is opposite unmoved, change of motion are opposite unchanging, composed of matter and form is opposite of simplicity. If these things are opposite this thing, what is the analogia, the analogy? Because this says that that essence is like creatures. How? Divine ideas forms the exemplars in the divine essence. Aquinas is very clear about that. These exemplars or forms become the patterns, the bases for all of the created things. The created things are multiple, they're moved, they're changing, etc. Now, so you see the problem here. Wait a minute. The forms or ideas that are the patterns of creatures are based on the essence. But God's essence isn't like any creature. Duh, right? Is that not odd? Do you see what I'm getting at? There's no similarity between the thing that is absolute being, absolute unity, absolute rest, absolute eternality, absolutely unmoved, unchanging, and simple. Aquinas says, no, there is a similarity based on likeness of being caused. Okay, but God isn't caused. So he's the unmoved mover, the unactualized actualizer. So there's no similarity. This whole position is based on an analogy. Entis means being. What is the analogy of being? Okay. The created effects that we're seeing, that we're perceiving. Causal chains. That's going to be a problem here. We will mention that. This is called occasionalism. This is tied to atomism. That, by the way, they didn't get from the Greeks, they got from all. Yeah, right. So we have this divine mind, supposedly. What's a mind? It's an analogy to this. Do you see that the more that we say the names of this thing, the giant cookie in the sky, the unmoved cookie, we're not saying anything. And this is precisely why St. Gregory Palamas, as we'll see, says if you call God pure act in himself, you're an atheist. This leads to atheism. And it also leads to not knowing that the created order is created. How can it be a created order when this needs something to actualize? There's no such thing as pure act if he's not acting to actualize something. Now, he's not actualizing himself because he's unmoved. So what is the unmoved mover, the first actualizer, etc., the unactualized actualizer? What is he moving? Well, Aristotle said, well, if he's eternal and his self-referencing thought, Aristotle thought he's self-reference thinking himself and his own ideas of the created things. And that eternally, because he never stopped, it was always thinking, that eternally birthed the world. So Aristotle is more consistent than these people or these people, because he understands from his own philosophy that The unmoved mover must have something to move. And to have something to move is something other than himself. He possesses no distinctions. Distinctions are features of the external world, the created world.